Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you for this midweek podcast this week.
Right. Flying through the week, hump day, and all that silliness.
Yes.
But still Mental Health Awareness Month.
That's right. In the last couple of weeks, our midweek podcast has focused on new disorders. Now put that in air quotes, new disorders that have made their way into the common vernacular and the way that we're talking about various things. And we're going to sort of continue that conversation today, but talk about it from a slightly different perspective, because, we've seen this many times in our office and in our practice. But it was great because there's been a few articles lately talking about, not only the increase in awareness of mental health conditions and the increase in prevalence of mental health conditions, but also the way in which we're looking at some of these conditions and diagnoses, all overall, the way that we're even thinking about them.
That's right.
Focus on that today.
Mm-hmm. In the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about what they're not really diagnoses, and I like your air quote thing. They are names of disorders, that could become diagnoses. Today, we're going to talk more about actual diagnoses that are in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So not just fictitious or possible, but the diagnoses that currently exist. And what prompted us to talk about this is this rapid increase in the incidence of mental illness, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, and especially in adolescence. Roughly ages 13 or 14 to 24, 25, that sort of adolescent and young adult population. And right. There are numerous explanations offered for the increase. But in fact, there was an article yesterday. They've announced this year's National Teacher of the Year was announced recently, end of the school year. And she said in her speech that the biggest challenge facing today's teachers are mental health issues of their students. Okay, that's a pretty bold statement to say this is the single biggest challenge that teachers are facing today is the mental health of their students. So Absolutely. There's something in the air, there's something in the water, there's some issue here that is percolated to the surface.
Right. And as you said, there's a lot of reasons why we've had this increase, everything from, positive things like the destigmatization of mental health conditions, social media. We've talked before about Dr. Google. So there's lots of things that we've talked about before that sort of help explain why we've had this significant increase. But like we've talked about before also, we have to be aware that really this over-identification is potentially problematic because, statistically, only about 20% of people have a true, authentic mental illness, and so
I can't emphasize that enough.
Right. That means 80% of us, 80% don't, and far more than 20% of people talk about having some kind of mental illness. People who like to keep their house clean refer to themselves as having OCD. Well, no, you like a clean house. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So what comes along with the destigmatization and some of that increased awareness is this overall increase in acceptance and self-identification of having a mental illness when a mental illness probably isn't really present.
That's right. And I think we have to keep going back to that there's an 80% chance that whatever you're experiencing is probably not a mental, it may be, but there's an 80% chance. And that's, if I tell you there's an 80% chance of rain today, you're probably not going to plan an outdoor activity because there's a reasonable certainty that you're going to get rained on. It's the same with mental illness. There's an 80% chance that this is not a mental illness. Now,
Right.
it might be, but chances are it isn't. But the other thing is that when we talk about a diagnosis, we have to include some type of impairment. And when we talk about impairment, we're not talking about discomfort. Discomfort is not an impairment. A life challenge. Oh, I get nervous when I talk in front of groups. That's a life challenge. That's not an impairment. Okay. So we need to be very careful that even when we move into when we start to talk about mental illness, we have to include impairment. Given that, then we want to talk about the 20%. Let's talk about this concept of being mentally ill, because when we talk about rates of mental illness increasing, we're talking about the 20%. There are more and more people falling into that category. We
Right.
need to understand why and what that means and what the possible downsides of
Right.
this, what one person calls prevalence inflation.
Right.
Okay. We have to talk about the downside of assuming that you have a mental health, a mental illness.
Right. Yeah. And that term prevalence inflation comes from a couple of researchers at University of Oxford,
Right.
where they talk about sort of this drive for people to identify mental health disorders when what they're really experiencing are mild or even transient symptoms. And
Right.
so you're experiencing these again mild or transient symptoms, and then either going to see a professional or again seeking treatment for a mental health disorder. And really that just inflates the numbers. It inflates the numbers, but it also inflates the treatment. You and I have talked recently. There's a huge issue here in the United States right now with a shortage of ADHD medication.
Right.
Well,
Mhm.
part of the reason for that is that many people are being identified and medicated for ADHD that don't really have ADHD.
That's right.
I mean, only some of the highest numbers suggest that only about 11% of people have ADHD. Now that's a high number when you're talking about any particular disorder, but
Mhm.
when you're talking about 11% of kids with ADHD, that's there are far more kids than that are being medicated for ADHD.
Right.
So we have this prevalence inflation problem, and it's creating an issue for lots of other people, including those with authentic, real mental health conditions.
Right. And we have to remember, what are the three most prevalent mental illnesses? ADHD, depression, and anxiety.
Right.
Think about what we're talking about there. Are we talking about real mental illness? Are we talking about symptoms that may not, that are very common?
Right.
Most of us experience anxiety, most of us experience depression, most of us experience ADHD symptoms. Do we really have the diagnosis?
Right.
Okay.
Because let's say that when you really have those diagnoses, that is a real mental health condition. That is a real mental illness.
Right.
But just because you're sitting in a class that you're not interested in, and
Right.
the teacher's talking for, an hour
Mhm.
about stuff that you have no interest in, that you have no knowledge about, just because it's hard to pay attention in that class doesn't mean that you have ADHD.
Right. And you may not want to be in college. I mean, many colleges, I can't college, I don't want to do my homework. It's not because you have ADHD. Maybe you ought to go to chef school, or maybe you ought to become an engineer, or become something that you want to be. Don't force you, if you try to force yourself into something you're not, you're going to have symptoms.
Right. Absolutely. So the other risk to this is that we're creating a culture and a group of people that believe that they are far more vulnerable, and they're more likely to have problems than they probably really are. We talked before about sensitivity to rejection, and that difficulty with accepting demands or expectations being placed on people. you know when people There are normal demands that we have to be able to tolerate. There are normal forms of rejection that we have to be able to accept. And
Mhm.
we're creating this climate where people feel as though they have no ability to handle any of that. And I can't think of anything healthy about that. That
Right.
just seems so problematic, and it's going to create so many more problems into that person's future.
Right. The other thing that when we talk about prevalence inflation, the other thing that's happening is that more and more people are seeking professional opinion. They're
Mhm.
either getting it online or from other people, or they're going to professionals. Think about this for a moment. How do we know how many people have depression? Well, hospitals and clinics report data. They report, it's collected yearly. This is how many people made their way into the mental health system. Okay, we have insurance data. Okay. Well, if you don't go to the doctor, you're not going to be counted.
Right.
But if more people go to the doctor, then more people are going to be counted, because when you walk through those doors, you're going to get a diagnosis.
Mhm.
You're going to get a diagnosis because the insurance companies demand it.
Right.
Okay. If you don't make a diagnosis, you might not get reimbursed.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just saying that's the system we have.
Right.
How do we count the people who have anxiety? We count them from insurance claims. We count them from hospital visits. We count them from physicians doing an evaluation or psychologists doing an evaluation. So if you walk through the doors, you're going to be counted. If you don't walk, I remember when ADHD first started years ago. Why do more boys have ADHD? They don't. Boys act out more than girls. And so boys get identified
Right.
and referred for services, and girls didn't. Girls suffered in silence
Right.
with the inattentive type of ADHD. So who's walking through the doors? There are more people accessing professional services, and therefore it looks like more people have mental illness. But
Right.
it may just be that more people are accessing services, not
Absolutely.
because they have more mental illness.
And where this leads, and as you said, the focus really is on, as we think about people who have been diagnosed with a mental health condition. One of our major concerns is that people are starting to use their mental health condition or their mental illness as a way of identifying themselves, as part of their identity. We used to say, I have a hard time with this because I have ADHD,
Right.
or I have depression, or I have bipolar, or I have this or that. Now people refer to themselves as that. They
Right.
don't say I have autism, they say I am autistic. And it becomes, even though that's a subtle difference in the vocabulary, that difference is really important because it becomes, or has now become, part of their identity. And when as mental illness is part of your identity, it really changes the whole way in which you're thinking about yourself and your mental health symptoms.
That's right. There was a time back in the 90s where people became very sensitive to this issue of, no, you shouldn't say she's autistic. You should say she has autism.
Right.
Now what's happened is it's been turned on its head,
Mhm.
because now young people are talking about themselves as autistic. I am autistic. I am it's more than just I have a diagnosis. It's this is who I am. This defines me. My multiple personality disorder defines who I am.
Right.
Therein lies a problem. Okay,
Right.
because you are not your diagnosis.
Right. And then it's used as ways to self-limit, that it's used as a way, I
Right.
can't do that because I am this.
Right.
And what it does, I think that the big way that I think about it, the big problem in the way that I think about it, is that if you have something, you can treat it. If you are something, then it's just something that you accept, and it's just something that you take, and you are sort of like saying, there's nothing I can do about it. I am this. I am a male. That's just what I am. I can't do anything about it. And that's a very definitive and rocky way to think about mental health conditions, especially if you have any interest at all in seeking treatment.
Right. And that's what we're seeing today, is that you have somebody say, well, I have generalized anxiety disorder, therefore I can't.
Right.
I have bipolar bipolar disorder, therefore I can't. I have this, so therefore I can't go to school. I can't go to a regular school. I can't be out in public. Therein lies the problem, is that you're using the diagnosis not just to understand yourself, but you're actually using it in a way that limits
Yeah.
how much life you live.
Right. Yeah. And there's something to say about the way in which we name things. And I've talked with patients about this before and all, but naming something, there are cultures in the world that really put a lot of emphasis on this. Like when you name something, when you call something out by its name, that there's an emphasis, there's a power, there's a recognition associated with that. People joke sometimes about, he who shall not be named, or the Harry Potter movies, and nobody wanted to say Voldemort's name. But the idea with all of that is that there is a power, there is an emphasis and significance that is made when you name something. The Bible was very specific when it talked about, God and Adam named things. They provided a name for all of the animals and all of the things in the world. That's one of the big things that science does. Science looks to name things when it identifies something that's never been seen before. But as soon as we name it, you give it an identity and a substance. It becomes something. And so when we name ourselves, when we identify ourselves by these mental health conditions or these mental illnesses, it gives it a power that extends far beyond just the disorder itself or just the illness itself. It makes it much more powerful and much more difficult to manage.
That's right. And I cannot emphasize enough this idea of naming, because just because we give something a name doesn't make it real.
Right.
Okay. These are not, depression doesn't exist in nature.
Right.
Okay.
It's not tangible. You can't.
No, it's not like a rock or a tree. Okay, it's not a real living entity. Okay.
Right.
And that's very important here, because just because you name something doesn't make it real. All right. So you take on a diagnosis and say, well, this is who I am. No, that's not who you are, because that's not a real thing. You're male or you're female or you're 6 feet tall or you're 4 feet tall. That's real. Okay. Your height is real. But these other concepts that we have names for, naming it doesn't make it real.
Right.
Okay. So that's the first. So the first thing we name things. Second, we also categorize, we put things into groups. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you name something, but then you also put all the names into categories. So like, this is a fruit, and this is we were all surprised when we learned that tomatoes are fruits and not vegetables. Okay. That was always a big shock to everybody the first time they hear that. So we put things into categories. We name things and categorize things in order to understand them better.
Right. Yeah.
But it doesn't make them real. It helps us understand.
Right. Absolutely. And it's the same way with the DSM.
That's right.
It identifies clusters of symptoms, clusters of characteristics, and it says when this cluster of symptoms are present, and as you said a minute ago, and there's an impairment in functioning, we're going to identify that cluster of symptoms and that impairment as this disorder, that's with this name.
That's right.
You have these symptoms and it causes an impairment in function, that's depression or that's ADHD. Again, it doesn't make it any more tangible. It doesn't make it any more observable than without a name. It's just the name makes it easier for us to communicate and and look into it and research it and try to understand it, so that we know that we're all talking about the same thing. When we say depression, major depressive disorder, we all have some image in our mind based upon the diagnostic criteria of what that is.
That's right.
It doesn't make it it doesn't give it any other substance.
Right. It doesn't
what it is.
Right. It doesn't substantiate. It doesn't make it real. Okay.
Right.
So the word for that is it is a presumptive diagnosis. But it's like we presume that it exists in some way. But they are also hypothetical. They're
Right.
hypothetical constructs. They're not real. There's no real entity of anxiety. I can't measure it. When we say
Right.
real entity, it has to be observable by your senses. Okay, you have
Right.
to be
Well,
able to see it.
you think about cancer.
Right.
Something that is observable, that is something that you can measure, that's something that you can take a sample of, that's something that you can test.
Right.
You can't do that with depression. You can
Yeah.
test, you can look at the symptoms, or you can look at diabetes, you can look at heart disease, because you can see that there is damage to the heart, or you can see that in the bloodstream there is less insulin, or there's more sugar, or however, but you can see that, and there's some substance to it. There are no such tests for any mental health condition.
And we say that all the time. There is no lab test for ADHD or dyslexia or depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder. There
Right.
aren't any genetics tests. There are nothing because, and in 2009, a group of researchers got together. But the people who build DSM know all of this. I mean, we're not telling them anything they don't know. They're fully aware of this. They do the best they can. They're doing the best that they can. And in fact, several leaders said, who built DSM-5, said, we really ought to update this thing to try to capture what is present in nature. Present in nature is real, okay? They tried it. They couldn't find anything. There are no genetic markers. There are no neurobiological markers for these things. We name them because they have similar characteristics and they seem to fall into categories. So the most that the manual does is it organizes clinical syndromes, and syndrome is a collection of symptoms, into meaningful categories. But the syndromes are still hypothetical.
Right.
They don't exist in nature. They are hypothetical constructs that we have simply named, like God named darkness and light. Adam named all the animals. Slave owners named their slaves. It gave ownership. It gave understanding. It gives understanding to these things, but they're not present in nature and they're not real.
Right.
There are no genetic or neurobiological indicators.
Right. So it's not real. They're not present in nature. And and we don't have these ways of measuring them with any tangible way.
No.
But what's happening is that when we have this, again, climate where individuals are identifying themselves by these disorders or by these conditions or in these different ways, and
Mm-hmm.
they are using that as a way to, as a definition, as a part of the definition of their identity, and it's becoming who they are.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And it's extremely problematic because once you label it, once you identify it, then it's yours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it makes it really difficult then to extend to treatment. For example, it's really hard when a person comes in here. They're among the most difficult people to try to help, because once it's part of their identity, the people don't really want to let that go. They say they want to let that go. They say they want to improve, but when it's part of their identity, it is really difficult to help them release that.
And we all have patients who are challenging us in that way, is that they will say, well, I have DID. DID is
Dissociative identity disorder.
dissociative, thank you, identity disorder. And it used to be called multiple personality disorders. Okay, so most people know it by that name. I have DID, and they refuse to let go of it.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot take it back once they've attached it, once they've made it who they are. They refuse to let go of it because it's absolutely terrifying, because they've lost identity.
Mm-hmm.
And therein lies the problem, is that it is their identity and they don't know who they are without the diagnosis.
Right. Yeah, think about we see this with so many other things. You take an online personality test and the person says, "Well, I'm an introvert." Well, in psychology, we know that nobody is 100% introvert or 100% extrovert. It just doesn't exist. We are all, maybe you lean one direction a little more than
Right.
the other, but there are some situations where you're more extroverted and some situations where you're more introverted. We know
Mhm.
that that's the case. Look at astrological signs. How many people identify themselves? I am an Aquarius.
Right.
And oh, okay. I mean, there are lots of traits of many of the astrological signs that can explain me, but because if I identify as Aquarius, then that's the only thing that I'm going to agree with. Um, Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, we sort of create these categories, as you said, and when we identify ourselves in that way, we are putting ourselves into a group. And
Right.
then we seek out others who associate with that group as well.
That's right. And I think that's a very good way to conceptualize, and what we're trying to explain about psychiatric diagnoses is they're not a little bit, they are like personality tests or astrological signs or generational names, Gen Z, Gen X. They're helpful in us understanding ourselves a little. Oh, okay, well, you're an Aquarius, so blah, blah. But psychiatric diagnoses are becoming like those things, okay? But they help us to understand. In this article, there's a woman who has autism, and she's very clear about hanging on to that label. But for the first time, I understood who I was, okay? Autism, she said, autism is such an integral part of my identity that if you took it away, I wouldn't know who I was.
Right.
I am autism, okay? And that's how she defines herself. And the label has become her identity.
Mhm.
But autism is still it's not real. It's not like diabetes. It's not like a hip dysplasia.
Right.
It's we've given it a name that doesn't make it real.
Right.
So
So I guess as we wrap up today, I guess the message is, and whether it was what we talked about the other weeks regarding, rejection sensitivity, or we talk about demand avoidance, or whatever the case may be, or you're someone who is identifying or using a psychiatric illness to identify them yourself. Um, we're trying to share is we need to back away from some of those tendencies, because a lot of mental health symptoms are a normal part of life. Any psychiatric condition that you can think of, there is a time period in life, whether it's situational or just a developmental period, where those symptoms are perfectly normal.
right,
Even if you talk about hallucinations, there are times in which hallucinations are perfectly normal and are not, schizophrenia or anything like that. So we need to back away from this tendency to give everything a label and to then use that label as a way to identify ourselves, that I am this, I am that, because it puts us into a sort of situation where we are who we are, and then we have a real resistance, sometimes subconscious resistance, to changing anything about it. And if we want
mhm,
to improve, if we want to get better, we have to separate ourselves from that so that we can then address those issues and resolve some of those issues that's contributing to the problem.
right. So even if we talk about not, even if we talk about the diagnoses, the over several hundred diagnoses that are in DSM-5, even if we talk about those, it's perfectly okay to try to understand yourself as being a person with bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder or autism. That it's perfectly okay to understand yourself better because you have because you have ADHD. Okay. But remember that just naming it, the label doesn't make it real. I think it was by borderline personality disorder didn't exist in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, it wasn't until later that that diagnosis was even made. So it didn't come into existence. It came into existence because we named those things something. It didn't come into existence because it was born of something. Same with ADHD, same with autism. Why do we have this significant increase in autism? Because we're seeing more patients are making their way in to get the diagnosis.
Right.
But the diagnosis doesn't make it real.
Right.
And most of all, a diagnosis doesn't mean you can't or you must. Well, I have to do this because I have. No, no. You have this diagnosis. These are your life challenges. This is what you now need to do.
Yeah.
It doesn't absolve you. It doesn't absolve you of responsibility. It doesn't make it acceptable. These are your challenges. We all have them. These are yours. So you have to work within those challenges. You have to work on those challenges.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate point, is that we, instead of identifying yourself as that, which just leads to we'll just use the word excuses of saying, I can't do these things because I am this.
Mm-hmm.
We can say, I have difficulty doing those things because I have these symptoms.
Right.
That second way of thinking about it sure does leave a lot of room for improvement, sure does leave a lot of room for getting better and overcoming some of those limitations.
Right.
So vocabulary is important, naming things is important, and so we have to be careful with that power. So
Right. I think years ago, if I might, when we took classes in college years ago, some of them were you had to do public speaking. Okay. Well, not everybody wanted to do that,
right.
but we overcame it. Okay. And the value was learning to overcome it.
Mm-hmm.
To say that, well, you're a little bit anxious, so you don't have to do that anymore, then you're denied the opportunity to overcome. And I think that's a problem. I think that we should rethink how we're dealing with these challenges.
Right. Yeah. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is the ability to recognize your fear and then to overcome it. And so
Right.
that's what we need to do, is we need to work to overcome some of those symptoms or some of those things that we feel are limitations. And that's where true courage comes into play. So, all right.
Yep.
That's it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.